Chapter 1. The thread begins. The sun had not yet cleared the hills when the spinning room filled with quiet stirring. Each servant moved without words, the way bees do when they know their task before the light returns. The hearth had been kept burning low through the night, and the embers now glowed as someone stirred it back to flame. Bundles of carded wool lay piled on low stools, freshly combed and ready to twist, stretch, and pull into thread. Weaving never began with the loomlet, started days before. With soft tufts of fleece teased from shivering sheep, the fleece came dirty, matted, and heavy with lanolin, picked clean by hand and soaked in ash water to cut the grease. Women stood at large tubs with sleeves rolled high, rubbing the fleece against boards until it ran white like cloud. The wet wool was hung over the hedges or stretched on racks outside the spinning cottage. Crisping in the sun, once dry, the women combed it with iron-toothed paddles, drawing the locks smooth until they resembled pale ribboned hair. The carded rolls were stored in baskets that smelled faintly of smoke and sheep and the distant whisper of field grass. On this morning, Elsbeth took her seat by the window where the wheel waited, its spindle dark with oil and wear. She adjusted her stool with practiced silence, one hand already tugging a roll from the basket beside her foot. Threading the wool into her fingers, she pressed the treadle, and the wheel spun with a sound like wind in a hollow tree. The fibers twisted between her fingers as they fed into the spinning spindle, turning the fleece into strong, clean thread. No one had taught her with books or diagrams. Her mother's hands had guided hers until she no longer thought about it. Now, years later, her hands moved from memory and muscle, from the rhythm her body had memorized before she could count. In that room were half a dozen other women, and all of them worked the wheel without speaking unless something fell or spilled. The sound was hypnotic. The treadle's soft thump, the creak of wood, the faint hiss of wool stretching tight before twist. Some women liked to sing under their breath while they worked, lullabies they had forgotten the origins of long ago. Elsbeth preferred silence, not because she loved quiet, but because her thoughts were louder when no one interrupted them. She counted the turns with her toe and gauged the tension with her thumb, eyes never leaving the twist forming from the fleece. Her wool was not dyed, yet would remain this gentle cream color until the master dyer added his tinctures and fumes. Dyes came later, after enough thread had been made, washed, and hung, soaked in alum or vinegar to fix the future colors. The wheel slowed and stopped, and she reached for another roll, her knees aching from the cold stone floor beneath the stool. From outside came the cluck of hens and the groan of the barn gate opening, someone fetching morning hay for the beasts. Elsbeth leaned back, wiping her palms on her apron, and looked out the window toward the low hill behind the cottage wall. The Loom house stood just beyond the orchard, closed still, but soon it would ring with the taut snap of the shuttle. Weaving would not begin today, not for her. Not until enough thread had been spun and wound into skeins for warping. She worked until her basket was empty, and the skeins were hung like limp ropes along the drying beam over the hearth. By then the sun had broken through, lighting the fine motes of dust floating through the spinning room like golden ash. She flexed her fingers, now sore and reddened, and remembered her mother telling her that strong cloth began in the fingertips. A poor spinner made weak thread, and weak thread meant broken cloth, and broken cloth meant shame and wasted hours. There were punishments in other villages for wasting good fleece whipping fines, or being barred from the loom altogether. Here it was different. The shame came with silence, and the glance of the overseer as he inspected each skein for weakness. Elsbeth gathered her finished bundles and set them in the large tub near the hearth, ready to be boiled and bleached. Others did the same, their arms full, their faces still expressionless, though their backs ached from hunching and treadling. She walked outside into the yard, her fingers trailing along the smooth stones that lined the path to the dye house. A pot already steamed inside, and an older woman stirred it with a stick as long as her arm. Careful not to splash, the smell was acrid bark, copper, crushed roots, preparing for later when the white threads would take on color like breath. Elsbeth didn't wait. She only watched a moment before turning back toward the well. Lifting the bucket with a grunt, clean water for rinsing was always needed, and though she hated the cold sting on her hands, she poured it with practiced ease, all this every morning. Every hour was what came before a single line of cloth was ever woven on the loom's frame. The spinning, the boiling, the drying, the dyeing, the warping, the winding it was the preparation that made cloth worth wearing. When she finally walked to the loom house that evening, her arms carried nothing but her thoughts and the ache of her limbs. She paused by the door, staring up at the great wooden frame inside, silent for now, but waiting, always waiting. Tomorrow the shuttle would move, and the warp would stretch across like taut strings, waiting for a melody to be played. Tonight she would rest, fingers still twitching with phantom spinning, ears still ringing with the whir of the wheel, and in her sleep she would dream not of finished garments, but of threadless, thin, and stretching out into forever. Chapter 2. The Wheel and the Whisper. Morning fog crept low across the valley, threading between the hedges like a quiet spirit lost in thought. The chimney of the spinning room puffed its first smoke as the embers were rekindled from the night's soft decay. Elsbeth arrived before most, her cloak still damp with dew, fingers stiff from the air that bit without warning. Inside, the room smelled as it always did: wood smoke, oil, sheep's wool, and something faintly sweet from the last dye pot. She removed her cloak, shook off the mist, and folded it over the peg near the hearth where heat licked at its edge. Her wheel waited in the corner like a sleeping pet, loyal and old, polished smooth where her hands had worn the wood. She placed the basket beside her stool, filled with rolls of fresh fleece combed the night before, while the stars still shone. Each roll was a promise, soft and potential, ready to be pulled into a line of thread thinner than a whisper's edge. As her foot pressed the treadle and the wheel began its gentle spin, the room filled with sound, both ancient and constant. Other spinners arrived one by one, greeting not with words, but with glances, nods, or the quiet thud of their baskets set down. There was a rhythm to these mornings, a silent agreement of movement, where each woman became part of a larger breath. Their wheels turned in imperfect unison, and their hands drew out wool into lines of strength and usefulness without end. It was not fast work, nor was it always clean, but it was work passed down from mother to daughter, like a family name. Elsbeth's fingers moved with muscle memory, twisting, guiding, never rushing. Haste made knots, and knots broke cloth. Outside, crows called to each other from the thatched rooftops, their cries sharp against the hush of human industry. Inside, the wheels spoke in softer voices, wood on wood, wool stretching, the clack of a dropped spindle now and then. There were no clocks in the spinning room, no bells to mark hours. Time was measured in thread, and how much filled the beam. When a spindle filled, it was wound carefully into a skein, tied gently with twine, and laid across the wooden frame to rest. Each skein was inspected by the overseer, an older man with eyes like flint, who rarely praised but always noticed flaws. Elsbeth had learned not to fear his silence. It meant her thread held, that her work passed the unspoken standard of the house. One girl near the window was new, and let her thread pull too thin. It snapped, and she gasped, hands flailing to catch the end. No one scolded, but the room's attention shifted briefly before returning to the quiet labor that demanded no mistakes. Elsbeth remembered her first day, the burn of embarrassment, when her thread snapped 3 times before she found the right rhythm. She'd cried that night, fingers raw, shoulders sore, convinced she'd never be strong enough to spin as her mother once had. But years pass quickly when you work the same wheel, and now her fingers spun with certainty, even as her thoughts wandered. She thought of colors, the way madder turned thread red as blood, or how woad stained everything it touched a deep, secret blue. The dyer's hands were always stained like bruises, but his threads came out like magic, each shade richer than the last. Colors made the work feel real, like dreams turned into fabric you could hold, wrap around your shoulders, or sell in market stalls. But before color came the wheel, and before the wheel came the fleece, and before that the sheep, bleating in distant meadows. The thread in her hands had once been part of something living, something warm, and now it moved toward a second purpose. Spinning was not just a chore, it was transformation, a kind of alchemy done without fire or gold, but with patience and time. When the hearth's flame burned low, one woman stood to feed it, and the room glowed brighter for a few moments of comfort. Elsbeth adjusted her treadle, shifted her seat, and pulled another roll from the basket, her breath fogging faintly in the air. The rhythm resumed: treadle, draw, twist, guide, wind over and over, like a lullaby hummed by hands instead of lips. Her back ached, but she ignored it, too deep in the movement. Her fingers now separate from thought, a part of the thread itself. The sun climbed higher, beams of gold spilling through the wooden slats in patterns that changed with every passing hour. Dust danced in the light, little motes flickering like tiny spirits, drifting lazily while the women continued their task. She finished her 5th skein before pausing, wiping her palms on her apron. The skin chapped from days of wool and work. Lunch was quiet bread, onion, a sliver of cheese, and water cool from the well, eaten without ceremony on the steps outside. They returned soon after, no bell to call them, only the weight of unfinished thread and the pull of duty at the wheel. Afternoon brought more spinning, and sometimes song low and soft. Tunes passed from ear to ear without ever needing to be written. Elsbeth never sang, but she listened, letting the melodies mix with the spinning like harmony hidden in the hum of labor. The day passed in turns of the wheel, in feet-pressing treadles, and in the slow winding of something useful from something soft. When she stopped at last, her legs were numb and her neck tight, but her basket was empty, her spindle full, her work complete. She stretched her fingers, sore but proud, and hung her skeins across the beam, the thread shimmering slightly in the fading light. Evening brought cool wind and the scent of earth from outside, and Elsbeth gathered her cloak with care, folding it against her side. She looked back once before leaving, eyes tracing the lines of the wheel she would return to again tomorrow and the day after. Outside, the fog had returned, curling around the orchard trees, and her breath rose in clouds as she walked the stony path home. In the stillness of dusk, Her thoughts spun too of wool, of color, of cloth yet to come, of all the silent women at their wheels. And in the hush of the valley, the echo of spinning remained a whisper of motion, of effort, of life drawn out one thread at a time. Chapter 3. Threads for the dyer's pot. The morning began before the first bell, with stars still hanging pale above the smoky rooftops of the village. Elsbeth tied her apron with cold hands, breath clouding in the dim stable as she gathered the skeins prepared the day before. Each bundle of thread had been spun with care, wound evenly, and tied at intervals to keep it from tangling in the dyer's bath. She placed them gently into a linen sack, their pale, undyed softness like coiled rope from some mythical woolen sea. Today was dye day, and with it came a journey out past the fields, across the stream, and toward the crooked chimney of the dye house. The sun was barely rising when she set out, boots crunching over frost-hardened mud, the bundle of threads cradled in her arms. Faint birdsong accompanied her steps, and from a far barn came the first low bleat of sheep stirring in their pens. She crossed the stream on a plank bridge, slick with moss, careful not to slip, her precious work held tightly against her chest. The dye house sat alone among brambles, squat. Its door stood ajar, and the heat that poured from it was sudden and thick, filled with smells that clung earth steam, something sharp inside. Pots bubbled over stone fires, each filled with water and the essence of color matter, root, woad leaves, weld, and crushed bark. The dyer, a man named Willen, hunched over one pot, his sleeves rolled and his hands stained blue to the knuckles. He looked up only briefly as Elsbeth entered, grunted, then gestured to the hook where skeins were hung before soaking. She laid her bundles there, untying them one by one, careful not to drop or twist them, letting the steam rise into her face. The warmth was welcome after the cold walk, but the air was thick, and sweat soon beaded along her brow and spine. Willen spoke little, but his hands moved with practiced grace, stirring one pot with a wooden paddle, then adding more mordant to another. The pots hissed and simmered like cauldrons from stories of witches, but here the magic was color, and the spell was centuries old. He examined her thread, fingers pressing the fibers between thumb and forefinger, testing for spin, tightness, and readiness. A nod meant approval, and she exhaled with relief. Poorly spun thread would fray or die unevenly, and waste was not forgiven. Willen motioned for her to follow, and together they lowered the first skeins into the pot of madder, the red root tinting the water. The thread darkened immediately, but the true color would not appear until it dried. Dye was like time, it revealed only later. They worked in silence, lifting skeins, squeezing water, hanging them on lines stretched across the rafters, dripping red like threads of blood. Next came the vat of weld, the yellow so bright it seemed unnatural, a sun trapped in liquid, staining the wool a golden hue. Then the woad always lasts, always difficult. Its leaves fermented in a stone pit behind the house, turning the water green before it turned blue. Woad died not by boiling, but by trickery. Oxygen turned the thread blue only after it was lifted into air and breathed for a while. Elsbeth loved this part, watching the color emerge like magic from invisible hands, the thread going from pale green to deep sky. Her arms ached from lifting, and her fingers pruned from wet. But she stayed until every skein was hung, dripping color and steam. The dye house grew quieter as the fire settled low, and Willin began to scrape the sides of the woad vat with a long-handled spoon. Residue gathered there, a blue sludge he would later dry and grind into cakes, worth silver to traders who passed through. He didn't speak often, but today he said, "Your spin's strong, took color well, might keep some for finer weaving." Elsbeth only nodded, pride warming her chest more than the fires had. The compliment unexpected and earned without request. Color made thread into something more than useful, it made it desired, something to barter, wear, or cherish in a dowry chest. She watched her skeins turn in the warm air, dripping slower now, reds darkening, yellows settling, blues coming into full bloom. These colors would later be combined in patterns on looms, telling stories in geometry, held together by hands that understood their meaning. Not all thread was dyed, some remained natural, earthy, and plain, but those chosen for color were meant for noble sleeves or holy banners. Willin handed her a cloth to wipe her hands, and she did so gratefully, the damp wool smearing stains into the folds of her apron. As the last skeins cooled, she helped wind them into tighter coils, tying them with twine, ready to be carried back to the weaving shed. She left the dye house with arms full of color, her path marked by the scent of steam and bark and the memory of transformation. Crossing the plank again, she moved slower, careful with every step, the dyed skeins fragile until dried completely, like fruit just picked. The sun was higher now, warming the frost into dew, and the distant bells of the abbey rang in the midday hour. Her feet ached, and her shoulders protested the weight, but her heart felt full, as though she had carried home something more than wool. In the weaving shed, the other women paused to see her return, eyes glancing at the rich hues bundled in her arms. Some smiled, some whispered, and one or two touched the blue with reverence. It was rare, precious, almost holy. She laid the skeins on the rack, each one lined beside the others, a spectrum drawn from plants, soil, fire, and patience. The loom waited in the corner, bare for now, but hungry, its frame ready to eat color and thread and weave them into fabric. Tomorrow, the weaving would begin, and with it a new rhythm, a new kind of movement, just as ancient and just as sacred. But for now, Elsbeth rested her hands, watching the colors dry, her breath slow and steady, full of quiet satisfaction. And in that moment, surrounded by red, gold, and blue, she felt not like a servant, but like a maker of something meant to last. Chapter 4. Warp and weft at sunrise. Elspeth rose before the sun touched the shutters, her joints still stiff from yesterday's dyeing work. She washed her hands in cold water from the basin, the stains of color lingering on her skin. The weaving shed was silent as she entered, save for the ticking of the rafters adjusting to the morning chill. Her fingers moved by memory, lighting the lantern, setting her stool beneath the empty loom, preparing the warp. Warp threads ran lengthwise on the loom, taut like harp strings, each one requiring patience, placement, and precision. She opened the bundles of dyed thread, selecting deep reds and soft yellows, separating the skeins with reverent care. The threads had dried overnight, their texture firmer, ready to become fabric through skill, rhythm, and endless repetition. She began to string the warp beam, one thread at a time, the process slow and exacting, stretching each across the loom's breadth. Each thread passed through the heddle eyelets in thin wooden shafts, which would later control the rise and fall of the strands. There were hundreds, each guided by hand, her eyes squinting in the morning dim, her back already beginning to ache. This stage was vital. One thread misaligned, and the entire cloth could ripple or break under tension. She worked in silence, breathing in rhythm with the thread's passage, the loom creaking softly as it received the warp. Outside, other servants began their day-clanging buckets, muttered greetings, hooves on stone. But here it was quiet. She chose blue threads for the edges, a framing border of calm sky color, giving shape to the warm center of reds and golds, with the warp in place. She knelt to check the tension. Each thread must be equally firm, like a taut drum across the frame. Satisfied, she sat back and drank from a clay cup of weak ale, her breath forming mist even indoors. Next came the shuttle, carved from ashwood, its hollow belly holding the weft thread that would pass side to side. She loaded the shuttle with yellow thread, smooth and even, winding it around the quill until it filled the hollow perfectly. The shed was no longer still. The loom had awakened, and with it, the rhythm of weaving began. The shuttle flew between the warp threads, passed hand to hand, pulled through a gap opened by the rising and falling heddles. With each pass, she beat the thread down with the reed, tightening the weave, locking it in place, line by line. The fabric began to grow, first an inch, then more, a pattern slowly revealing itself, like embroidery from memory. Weaving was both loud and soft. Wood clacked, threads snapped, her breath hummed, but it was also deeply personal. Her hands moved without thinking, tracing the same motions her mother's had and her grandmother before her. Mist rose from the river nearby, drifting past the window, catching in the beam of light that crept across the floor. She paused to flex her fingers, then resumed, changing the weft to red for contrast. Forming a repeating band through the cloth, the hours slipped away, unnoticed, until the door opened and another girl entered with bread and cheese, wrapped in a cloth. Elsbeth thanked her, took only a few bites, and returned to the loom, unwilling to lose her pace or break her rhythm. By midday, the cloth was nearly a hand's length long, warm and heavy beneath the beam, colors blending in quiet harmony. She inspected the weave with narrowed eyes, fingers running over each line, checking for snags, gaps, or unevenness. Mistakes meant unraveling, reweaving, wasting hours. There was no room for pride if the thread betrayed your care. Elsbeth hummed an old melody, one meant to guide the rhythm of shuttle and beat. Its verses passed down among weavers alone. Outside, the sun reached its peak, casting sharp rectangles of light across the planks, warming her knees as she worked. She shifted to blue thread, repeating the border from the start, mirroring the edges to form a pattern of framed color. Sweat beaded at her temples despite the cold, her arms sore from the motion, but she pressed on. The loom groaned with each beat, the fibers tightening together, becoming something new, longer thread, but cloth. This fabric might become a tunic, or a wall hanging, or perhaps part of a marriage chest, if it pleased the steward. She did not ask where it would go. Her task was not to dream, but to make, and to make it well. As the light began to soften again, golden now instead of gray, she slowed her pace, stretching her arms behind her. The cloth she had woven was unrolled and admired by two other women who entered late in the day. They nodded approvingly, and one traced the red band with a finger, whispering, "Strong hands, good warp." Elsbeth felt the pride without smiling, simply nodding and beginning to wind the shuttle for the next section. The day was not done, not truly, but the hardest part was behind her, and the thread obeyed her fingers again. She tightened the tension once more, beat down the weft, passed the shuttle, and built another inch of fabric. Outside, the sky blushed with evening. Clouds edged in rose and purple, and the loom's shadow stretched long across the boards. The other women had left, but she remained, unwilling to part from the rhythm just yet. Another pass of the shuttle, another beat of the reed, another line added to the growing story of cloth. In this shed, Elsbeth was more than a servant. She was a creator, a keeper of color and pattern, a dancer between warp and weft. And as night whispered at the windows, she finally rose, stretched, and touched the cloth once more before blowing out the lamp. Chapter 5. Tension in the threads. The cold air returned just before dawn, wrapping the cottage in a silence too heavy for comfort. Elsbeth stirred beneath her woolen blanket, her fingers already twitching with imaginary thread, weaving before she even rose. The ache in her back from yesterday's weaving had settled deep, like the weight of an iron key at her spine. Still, she rose, dressed in her same woolen shift, and stepped into the bare stillness of the morning. A thin frost clung to the ground outside the weaving shed. Glinting like spun glass beneath the growing light, she paused to gather her hair into a knot, pinned it tightly, and wrapped her neck with a kerchief faded by years of wear. The loom waited for her like an unfinished conversation, its beams holding yesterday's threads in place, frozen mid-pattern. Elsbeth relit the lantern and checked the tension of the warp threads, one by one with her fingertips. Each thread had its own sound, its own vibration when plucked, a hidden song only a weaver could hear. She adjusted the beams by feel, tightening the back roller with careful force, watching the warp draw taut like bowstrings to loose, and the weft would ripple like water in the cloth, too tight, and the threads might snap in protest. The balance required was not only mechanical, but instinctually, understanding born through years of errors and corrections. Outside, a rooster crowed, but she remained inside, untouched by the farm's pulse, focused on the language of her loom. The tension was perfect now, the fabric firm, yet forgiving, ready to accept the next rows of weft. She reached for the shuttle and hesitated. Something was wrong in the cloth's pattern, something her hands had missed yesterday. A misthreaded heedle had tugged a single line off course, warping the geometry into a crooked slope. She frowned, her breath shallow, already knowing what must be done in weaving, inch by inch, until the error could be corrected. Her fingers worked backward through her own creation, undoing the rhythm of hours past with patience and control. This was the weaver's punishment, but also her privilege, the power to destroy and rebuild with purpose. Thread by thread, she pulled free the colored weft, winding it again carefully to preserve every inch of dye. The mistake lay 5 inches deep, a minor fault to the untrained eye, but Elsbeth saw it like a crack in stone. She adjusted the heddle's position, threading the rogue warp properly, and exhaled as it slipped into place with a soft hiss. The loom was whole again, and with it, her confidence restored like breath after drowning. She rewove the red band slowly, ensuring each pass of the shuttle nested into the last with clean alignment. The mistake vanished beneath her hands, hidden like a buried secret. The cloth smooth and quiet once more, Elsbeth resumed her pace, the rhythm of weaving finding her again like a familiar heartbeat. Outside, the world had awakened the distant bleating of goats, the creak of cartwheels, the low hum of village work. But within the shed, the tension hummed in the air and in the threads, every fiber singing in perfect line. She switched colors mid-weft, adding a pale green to the center of the cloth, a contrast meant to resemble spring shoots. The new thread was stiffer, dyed with nettle and copper, and she worked more slowly, to ease its stiffness into the weave. When cloths were examined by the steward, the pattern's harmony mattered as much as the dye or texture. One crooked line, one fading hue, and the entire bolt could be rejected or demoted to rag duty. Her hands trembled, briefly fatigue or worry. She could not tell, but she pushed forward, row by careful row. The day stretched long and slow as the cloth gained shape and the air warmed, melting frost into trickling streams outside. Midday light streamed through the shutters, casting golden lines across the cloth, making the red shimmer like fire. She paused to sip broth brought by a boy from the kitchen, offering a silent nod as thanks, too focused to speak. The cloth's surface now resembled a landscape, rising red hills, golden fields, a stripe of green like a riverbed. She ran her palm across it gently, feeling no breaks, no shifts, no betrayals in the tight bond of fibers. The tension held strong, the warp and weft embracing with perfect force, enough to hold, not enough to tear. Weaving was not just creation, it was restraint, precision, and unseen pressure masked by beauty. By afternoon, her arms ached again, but she dared not stop, for her pattern was nearly finished, and momentum was everything. The final section began dark blue, deep as twilight, to close the piece with a mirror of its beginning. Each shuttle pass marked a breath, a heartbeat, a promise kept between her and the loom she'd trusted since girlhood. And when the last line was beaten into place, she tied off the final thread and leaned back, blinking against tears, not from pain nor joy, but from the sheer tension that had gripped her all day, now finally loosened like a sigh. She unrolled the cloth and laid it over a wooden bar, smoothing it flat, letting it rest in the soft light. It measured nearly 2 yards in length, solid and sturdy, yet soft with years of learning woven into its core. She swept the scraps and thread ends from the floor, gathered her tools, and let her fingers run over the heddles once more. The loom was quiet now, the cloth complete, but the tension still hummed in her arms and her spine. Even in rest, the weaver remains aware, always listening for the thread that may one day break. Chapter 6. The dye pot murmurs. The wind outside had shifted by dawn, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain on stone. Elsbeth rose slowly, joints stiff from the day's weaving before, but her mind already focused on color. Today was for dyeing, and the air already carried its own palette mud, smoke, and something green beneath it all. She gathered the empty baskets, worn but sturdy, and slung them over her shoulder with practiced ease. The forest path was slick with dew, but familiar underfoot as she stepped past ferns and low branches. She was searching for color, not from paints or powders, but from petals, bark, and bruised roots. Near the edge of the trees, she knelt beside a patch of weld, its yellow-green stalks bending in the breeze. She harvested carefully, fingers wrapping around each stem with a reverence reserved for rare gifts. Weld would give her yellow, if simmered long enough with rainwater and alum from the steward's store. But it wasn't just about hue, it was about depth, richness, and permanence through wear and wash. She pressed the plants into the basket, layering them between clumps of marigold petals saved from market scraps. A second basket she filled with bark oak and birch, carefully peeled and stripped, for they would lend brown and rust tones. By the time she returned to the cottage, her arms ached again, the weight of color pressing against her spine. Inside, she set the dye pot over coals, adding water by hand from a wooden pail, each splash echoing in the small room. She laid out her plants in neat piles, one for yellows, one for golds, another for dark base tones from soot and bark. The cloth she had finished yesterday now rested on the beam, clean and untouched by dye, waiting for its final skin. She stirred the pot slowly as the water began to steam. Adding the weld first and pressing it down with a spoon, the color leached quickly, clouding the water with a greenish haze that turned golden as it boiled longer. Elsbeth added alum next, the metallic salt catching light like crushed pearl as it dissolved into the brew. The smell was earthy, almost bitter, but comforting in a way only a weaver could truly understand. She lowered a small test scrap into the pot and watched it curl, then deepen to a pale flaxen yellow. Satisfied, she dampened the end of the new cloth and began feeding it into the dye bath, slowly, carefully, evenly. The key was movement, constant and gentle, ever allowing the fabric to rest too long in one place. Uneven dyeing would betray her to the steward's eye and to her own pride, if nothing else. Outside, the rain finally arrived, tapping against the shutters as though mirroring the bubbling of the pot. She worked in silence. The only sounds, her quiet breathing, the flicker of flame, and the rustle of soaked cloth as she pulled the fabric out for inspection. The yellow glowed in the gloom of the cottage, soft but full of life. It reminded her of sunrise over hayfields or candlelight caught in brass. Honest and warm, she wrung the fabric gently, laying it flat to cool, and began brewing a second bath for the darker tones. Bark, soot, and crushed walnut shells soaked for hours, the water turning a deep ink black before she added salt. This time, she used wool threads, smaller, lighter, but even more temperamental in the dye pot's grip. The wool drank the black like it was thirsting, turning not true black, but something between ash and storm cloud. It was beautiful in its own way, shadowed and quiet, like the bottom of a well under moonlight. She stretched the threads across a drying rack, careful not to let them twist or knot. Each line had to remain straight, or else the weaving would ripple like a poorly drawn sketch. As the room filled with the scent of boiled plant and smoke, Elsbeth leaned against the wall and let herself rest. Her fingers were stained already yellow on the nails, black in the creases, proof of her day's labor. She thought of the noblewoman who might one day wear these colors, unaware of how deeply the dye had seeped into Elsbeth's skin. The dyes might fade with years and sunlight, but the work, the process, and the patience could not be unwoven outside. The rain continued, washing the dust from rooftops and filling barrels with silver-topped water. She used that rainwater for her final rinse, the purest kind, cold and clean. To set the dye, the fabric hissed as it met the cold, then relaxed, the fibers tightening and softening all at once. She hung the cloth to dry near the fire, adjusting the lines with clothespins carved long ago by her brother. They held the weight easily, the cloth swaying slightly as though it breathed in the warm room. Elsbeth sat beside it, brushing stray threads from her skirt, and stared at the yellow and ash-colored results. Color was not just for beauty, it was a message, a whisper of nature, transformed by fire and time. Tomorrow she would weave with these threads, adding gold and shadow to the next piece like a painter blends oils. But tonight she would sleep with the scent of weld in her hair and soot on her hands. She was tired, but fulfilled. Every murmur from the dye pot today had spoken with meaning and memory. And as the last ember glowed beneath the pot, she closed her eyes, already imagining the colors in motion. In her dreams they danced, threads twisting like wind. cloth unfolding like dawn over the hills beyond the village. The weaver's art was quiet, but its roots ran deep, coloring the very breath of time itself. Chapter 7. Patterns of Memory by the Morning Light. The dyed threads had dried stiff and fragrant near the hearth's last fading coals. Elsbeth stood barefoot on the cool stone floor, holding a skein of wool dyed in yesterday's golden hue. She traced the line of color between her fingers, remembering how the weld bubbled as it bled into the pot. Everything she touched carried memory, not just warmth and texture, but the rhythm of what had gone into its making. She set the wool beside the darker skeins, still carrying the scent of bark and smoke. Rougher, almost bitter, this day. The weaving of patterns would begin shapes drawn not with ink or chalk, but with tension and vision. Her loom waited quietly, the warp already stretched tight between the beams like harp strings silenced in song. She had spent the night before threading the heddles, each strand cradled through its own eye of polished bone. The pattern was not simple, nor overly elaborate, but balanced sharp angles nested within slow, steady curves. Some were passed down from memory, mother to daughter, servant to servant, pattern to calloused hand. Others she invented, guided by dreams or shadows, caught on cottage walls by candlelight flicker. She tied the first shuttle, packed with the gold thread, and sent it slipping through the open shed of the warp. Each pass required control, not too tight, not too loose, and the beater brought rhythm as it pressed the weft in place. The first row laid down a foundation, but she knew not to trust it until several passes had built the design. It was like planting seed faith that pattern would bloom if tended with patience, not haste, not pride. Hours passed unnoticed, marked only by the creak of the loom, the slap of the beater, and the soft breath from her nose. The room was quiet except for this, and she liked it that way noise tangled her mind more than thread ever could. She wove shapes that mirrored the field's outside, diamond tips like arrowheads, the rise of hills, stalks bending in wind. Each shape had a story behind it, even if the lady who wore the finished cloth never stopped to read it. There was one pattern her mother always used, sharp zigzag near the hem, meant to ward off illness or ruin, and though Elsbeth didn't quite believe in such things, she added it anyway, a thread of memory more than superstition. It was her way of speaking through thread, of preserving voices that time might forget. Hidden in wool and linen, she shifted to a second shuttle now. This one, carrying the dark ash-colored thread, nearly black in the low light. Its sharp contrast marked the change in design, and suddenly the gold seemed to glow brighter in comparison. She wove carefully, counting each pass, watching the spaces between grow smaller, the cloth becoming more real, more certain. By midday, her fingers were sore and her back stiff, but the pattern was emerging clean, repeating, woven like breath itself. The spindle spun idly near the door, waiting for another task, but the loom still claimed her full attention. She stopped only once to sip water and eat a crust of bread left from the early morning bake, and then she sat again, cloth gathered on her lap, one hand on the shuttle, the other steadying the edge. The room was warm now, sun breaking through the shutters in long golden lines across the plank floor. Her hands worked faster, muscle remembering what mind no longer needed to command aloud. With each repetition, the pattern wove not only into the cloth, but into her memory, as sure as footprints in clay. She remembered her first weaving a simple band, uneven and frayed, but made with joy that no mistake could dull. Her mother had kept that piece until the day she died, folded neatly in a chest beneath her sleeping mat. Now Elsbeth wove alone, but not without the weight of those hands before hers. Always pressing forward, always teaching. Sometimes she imagined her cloths speaking across time-telling of harvests. Winters survived, children born and grown. The finished cloth today would become a shawl or a tunic, perhaps sold to a merchant or gifted to a noble's kin. It might leave the village, travel across valleys or seas, worn by someone who'd never know her name. But her work would endure in every tight weave, every hidden knot, every turn of the pattern's logic. She wove to remember, to resist forgetting, to defy time's effort to unravel everything into dust. The shuttle passed again and again and again, and the cloth grew heavier in her lap, warm from friction by sunset. Her back ached and her wrists trembled slightly from the days-long repetition. She stood and stretched, stepping back to see the work from a distance, as though for the first time. The pattern was whole now, sharp in its contrasts, subtle in its balance, strong and smooth to the touch. She draped it over the bar near the hearth, admiring how the gold caught fire in the orange flicker of evening. Outside, the sounds of the village softened tools being hung. Doors closed, animals settling in straw. She sat beside the cloth and placed her hand gently on it, palm open, feeling the faint ridges beneath her skin. This was what memory felt like woven, warm, precise, imperfect, and carried forward one careful row at a time. The loom creaked behind her, still, but not silent. It would call again in the morning, asking for more. She closed her eyes, not yet asleep, and let her mind drift through the shapes she had made and those yet to come. For in every pattern she laid down, Elsbeth found not only cloth, but herself, caught and carried in thread. Chapter 8. The steward's visit before the morning sun had reached the far wall of the spinning room. Elsbeth heard the clatter of hooves. A sharp knock followed, not hesitant like a villager's, but swift, loud, and used doors opening fast. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the entryway, heart thudding like the loom's beater bar. The steward stood in the yard, his cloak damp from dew, his boots clean despite the muddy path. He never came without purpose, and his presence drew glances from every open shutter and half-latched stable door. "Elsbeth," he said, voice clipped, "the lady requests a bolt of cloth before the week's end." She nodded, bowing slightly, though her fingers tightened against the edge of the doorframe. "What length?" she asked, swallowing the stiffness rising in her throat like smoke from wet kindling. 5 Ls, he replied, in 2 tones, one natural, one dyed, patterned, no flaws. Then he was gone, without waiting for her reply, his cloak sweeping behind him like a drawn curtain. Elsbeth closed the door and leaned against it, breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her rising worry. 5 Ls was no small task, not on short notice, not alone, not when her shoulders still burned from yesterday's weaving. She had woven for the lady before, fine cloth, decorative bands, small trim, but never a full bolt in such time. Still, to refuse or delay meant worse than disfavor. The steward would return, and behind him, consequences. She stepped back into the weaving room, already calculating thread lengths, spindle loads, the dye she had left drying, the gold thread from weld, perhaps combined with undyed weft, would create a contrast rich but not too costly. Her fingers brushed the edges of her previous cloth, still resting near the hearth, a comfort she could not afford. She set the warp beam that afternoon, drawing long strands across the frame until her arms ached with repetition. Each thread had to be even, no snag, no slack, or the entire pattern would fall crooked before the second pass. Her comb flicked through the strands, aligning them like rows of soldiers, sharp and perfect in their place. By the time the sun dipped behind the orchard, her loom was dressed and ready. The threads tense with expectation, she ate quickly, bread soaked in broth, her eyes never leaving the silhouette of her task waiting in twilight that night. Sleep came in broken pieces, short dozes between visions of unraveling cloth and steward's boots. At dawn, she rose before the rooster's second cry and began her work under the cold hush of candlelight. The shuttle moved swiftly, smoother now, with every hour, her hands a blur between tension, beat, release, and gather. She chose a repeating diamond motif, familiar, elegant, traditional, and satisfying when seen from a distance. Midway through the second L, her shuttle snagged, catching on a loose thread she hadn't noticed during dressing. She stopped, heart hammering, and undid the last 2 rows, fingers nimble, precise, silent in their frustration. Mistakes weren't just flaws, they were stories told wrong, and the lady would hear them through touch, if not sight. Once corrected, she returned to her rhythm, counting under her breath. 1, 2, beat, return. 1, 2, breath, repeat. By the third day, her wrists were sore and red, her spine stiff from sitting so long without full rest, but the cloth had grown yards of it, tight, beautiful, the pattern sharp, as if carved into the fabric by a blade. Villagers passed her window in the late afternoons and stared in murmuring at her pace, her silence, her urgency. Even the children, usually bold with teasing, stepped lightly near her cottage, their eyes wide and curious. On the 5th morning, the last L's hung completed from the drying rod, still damp from steam and stretched to shape. She inspected each row, each selvage, every intersection of warp and weft, like reading a sacred text. The colors had dried trutha, gold still bright, the natural wool soft and clean, the pattern unmarred by haste. She rolled it tightly, binding it with clean twine, and wrapped it in linen to keep dust from its surface. Then she waited, standing in the doorway as mist curled along the road, her bundle cradled in both arms. The steward returned at midday, his eyes sharp, his mouth drawn in a line that never curved toward kindness. She handed him the cloth without words, and he weighed it in his hands like judging bread dough or butcher's meat. He nodded once, said nothing, then turned and rode off, dust rising behind his horse in measured silence. Elsbeth stood in the quiet left behind, her arms empty, her shoulders low, but her mind still racing with thread. She had completed the task, and well, no flaw, no fault, no complaint she could expect to echo back through him. But no thanks would come either, no word from the lady's chambers, no silver coin or warm bread in return. Her reward was simpler, knowing the cloth would endure. Her skill invisible beneath another's beauty and pride, she returned to her bench, her loom quiet for now, her hands rubbing together out of habit and restlessness. Perhaps tomorrow she would weave for herself scarf, a mat, something small and hers alone. But for now she rested, watching the patterns of light on the floorboards shift as clouds moved across the sun. In her bones she felt the echo of every motion, every beat of the shuttle, every row committed to cloth. The steward's visit had left no mark in the village, but in her hands it had shaped 5 L's of memory. Chapter 9. The Loom's Secret Language. Elsbeth had always known that cloth was more than warmth, more than wrapping or dress or banner. It held meaning woven not only in color and form, but in rhythm, repetition, and the tension between every strand. When her mother taught her to weave, she said nothing of letters or ink, only how to pull secrets from wool. "Each thread speaks," she had whispered once, while brushing loose lint from the warp beam's edge, "if you listen between the beat." Back then, Elsbeth thought it poetry, something nice to say to a child in a room of endless string. But now, seated before the loom again, the candle casting long lines across the weaving room floor, she understood. The creak of the frame, the hush of passing weft, the steady knock of the beater was a kind of language, not loud like voice, not quick like writing, but slow and rooted like tree rings beneath bark, always growing inward. Each pattern was a phrase, a wish, sometimes even a warning, passed from maker to cloth, then cloth to keeper. She remembered the piece her mother once hid inside the hearth, a narrow strip with red and black chevrons. Later, she learned it marked the birth of her brother stillborn, unspoken, memorialized, not in grave, but in wool. No one else had ever seen it, and yet Elsbeth could still feel the ache it carried when she closed her eyes. Now, as she prepared another warp, this time for market, she considered what message she might send unseen. Would a buyer notice the change in weft tension every seventh row, where her thoughts had drifted to memory? Could they feel the line where she remembered the taste of last autumn's apples, sour and cold in her cheek? Would they sense the shift in speed when a knock startled her at dusk, though it turned out to be the wind? The loom had become not just her tool, but her companion, faithful, solid, holding every mood she poured into it. Even on days she had nothing to say, it waited, offering space for thought as her shuttle made its quiet path. Villagers spoke of weavers with awe, not for wealth or position, but because their cloth lasted longer than stories. A wedding shawl handed down became an heirloom not just for its fabric, but for the woman who first wove it. Elsbeth once repaired such a shawl, a white one with blue stars, where the original thread had thinned at the corners. She matched the old pattern perfectly, but her additions held new secrets, dreams she'd had of snow, of bells, of seabirds. When the young bride wore it, she looked proud, but Elsbeth wondered if she also felt the quiet drift of the sea. Today's cloth would be simpler, a bolt of wool, gray with a band of russet, requested by the tanner's apprentice. He wanted it for a cloak, he'd said, for traveling to the next town and making his way without father or shop. Elsbeth admired him for his boldness, and so she wove courage into the cloth. Hidden in the placement of color, she used tight bands near the shoulders, a metaphor for strength, and let the hem shift gently, like walking into breeze. Her fingers itched as she worked, not from labor, but from the quiet joy of shaping something unseen and lasting. She thought of all the weavers before her, women mostly, quiet and constant, who had shaped whole histories in wool. Some had hidden messages for lovers, or blessings for children, or warnings for enemies, sharp as the threads themselves. One legend told of a weaver who sent news of invasion by twisting knots into a trade blanket bound for the border. The sentry who bought it read her warning, not with eyes, but fingers, and closed the gate before arrows flew. Elsbeth didn't know if that tale was true, but it felt possible because cloth never lied when woven by honest hands. She beat the weft firmly, not too hard, letting it nestle into place without force. the same way truths settle over time. The colors bled into each other just slightly, enough to blur the edges and soften the weight of the russet band. She dipped her fingers in water now and then, not just to smooth the thread, but to cool the heat rising from her palms. By late afternoon, her back ached, but the bolt was done, its pattern complete. Its story finished, though unspoken. She hung it over the beam to settle, letting gravity smooth the edges, and sat on the stool beside the hearth. She stared at it, thinking not of the buyer or the coin he'd offer, but of what she had said without saying. Tomorrow, it would leave her hands and enter the world, and someone else would wear it, unaware of what it carried, maybe under the russet band. He'd walk taller, feel braver, cross rivers and strangers, and come back with tales. And if not, if he simply wore it to stay dry and warm, that too would be enough, for cloth's purpose was never singular. Elsbeth leaned back, letting her eyes rest, her ears still catching the imagined beat of the loom, even in quiet. She could no longer recall what silence sounded like before she became a weaver, before every room hummed with thread. In the spaces between the noise, she could still hear her mother's voice, teaching her not with words, but with rhythm. And now, as cloth stacked on the shelf behind her, folded and waiting, she knew she was adding to a lineage. Each row she wove, each secret she placed, each small message tucked into color and pressure and pause, all of it formed a language only other weavers might read, and even they would need to listen, not just with eyes, but with hands, with breath, with memory, and with silence, for the loom did not shout, but whispered lasting truths. Chapter 10. The Merchant's Demand. The merchant arrived just past dawn, his boots caked in dust, and his cloak reeking faintly of travel and ale. Elsbeth was still sweeping stray flax threads from the floor when he rapped sharply at the lintel 3 times. She opened the door and found him frowning at the sky, muttering about rain as if clouds conspired against commerce. "I need cloth," he said before she could speak, eyes already scanning her shelves like a butcher eyeing joints of meat. "For what use?" she asked, though she hated the question. Most buyers had no idea what they truly needed. "Caravan tents," he grunted. "Long rolls, strong weave, waterproofed if possible. I leave in 6 days." Tent cloth, she thought bitterly, never appreciated, cut into flaps, tugged by oxen, dirtied, slept under, patched with grease and bark. Yet she nodded, because coin bought candles and salt, and his silver ring bore the sigil of a trade guild. He paced as she took out a sample thick twill she'd woven last season, left unwaxed but dense and tight at the edge. He pinched the fold, rubbed it between finger and thumb, and held it up to the light, scowling at what he could not see. "This will do," he grumbled, "but I want 10 bolts. No thinner than this, no flaws, and burn-proof if you can manage it." She wanted to laugh. Cloth wasn't stone, but held her tongue and nodded, hiding her irritation beneath a professional calm. He laid 5 silver groats on the table, then pushed a folded parchment toward her with the rest of the promise. "You'll have the rest once I collect it," he said. Before turning and striding out, without waiting for her reply, Elsbeth stared at the coins, dull and cold, already smelling faintly of wine and worry and unreasonable speed. She didn't ask why he needed tenting so fast. Perhaps trade was booming. Perhaps war had moved closer than she feared. Whatever the reason, she now had 6 days to produce enough thick cloth to line a caravan bound for some distant place. She set to work at once. adjusting the warp frame to accommodate wider passes, stretching the cords till they hummed tight. Wool would not do, it swelled too easily with rain, so she turned to flax, hauling bundles down from the loft above. She spun by firelight that evening, fingers raw from twisting fiber into strong thread, combing out burrs with wooden picks. The next morning she began the first bolt, letting the rhythm of the shuttle soothe her racing mind. She worked without pause, hands moving like clockwork, beat, pull, pass, beat, pull, pass, the sound like a drum beneath her breath. The cloth came thick and unyielding, tight enough to catch the wind like a drumskin, and sharp enough to fray bare fingertips. Still, she wove faster. The looms creak like groaning wood on an old ship's deck, resisting the storm but never breaking. She added beeswax to the thread, heating it slightly so it softened and slicked through the heddles without snag. By the end of the second day, her arms trembled, and she had woven nearly 2 bolts, folded and weighted with stones. She slept poorly, dreams filled with flapping tents and shouting merchants, silver that melted into thread and slipped through her hands. On the third day, her shuttle cracked, the edge splintering where it struck the frame, and she cursed so loudly the neighbor's dog barked. She carved a new one by candlelight, sanding the edge smooth with ash and oil, praying it would last the week. Time blurred into thread, hours stitched together by the repetition of motion and the never-ending whisper of the loom. On the 5th day, a storm rolled in, loud and wet, and her workshop turned dim beneath the slate-gray sky. Still she wove, squinting into shadows, counting rows by instinct rather than sight. Feeling for the tension of each thread, she didn't eat until dusk, too afraid to lose momentum, too aware of how quickly 6 days passed when cloth was due. Her cat brushed her ankle, confused by the shift in routine, and she offered it a scrap of salted fish without thought. By the 6th morning, the final bolt was nearly done, just 50 more rows, one last hem, and the cloth would be ready. Her hands blistered, her nails cracked, and she moved like someone twice her age, but the bolts stood stacked like soldiers. When the merchant returned, this time with 2 mules and a sullen-faced boy to help him, he looked pleased, though said little. He ran his hand down the edge of one bolt, testing the stiffness, grunted, then reached into his purse for the remaining coin. Elsbeth watched the silver fall into her palm, cold and heavy. The price of sore muscles and sleepless nights. "You did well," he said, softer this time, then looked at the bolts again and added, "Better than most men could have managed." She said nothing, only nodded, tucking the coin into a leather pouch and tying it shut with tired fingers. He turned to go, and the boy gave. Chapter 11. Fireside repairs. The fire had burned low by the time Elsbeth returned home. Her shoulders aching from weaving non-stop, she pulled her shawl tighter and stirred the embers with a blackened poker, coaxing the coals back to life. Outside, the night was cold and wet, the rain hissing on the roof like whispered curses from a long-forgotten god. Inside, the cottage smelled of wax, wool, and the faint iron temps of blood from a finger pricked one too many times. The loom stood silent now, the warp strings slackened slightly, its frame appearing almost skeletal without cloth wrapped tight across it. She sat near the hearth, holding her hands to the flame, the heat soaking slowly into her cracked skin and bruised joints. By her side, a pile of worn tools lay in a basket, shuttles, chipped heddles frayed, combs dulled and warped by long hours of use. Tonight wasn't for weaving, but for mending, not only tools, but everything else the craft had worn down. She began with the shuttle, the one that had splintered days ago, carving off the cracked edge with careful, practiced strokes. The knife she used was older than her loom, passed down from her mother, the hilt worn smooth by generations of use. She worked slowly, humming a low tune under her breath, the kind sung when spinning wool or patching shirts in candlelight. When the shuttle's edge curved smooth again, she rubbed it with oil and set it aside, nodding once in quiet satisfaction. Next came the headless simple lengths of thread and reed that directed the warp, now tangled and uneven from the last order's frenzy. She unwound them carefully, smoothing each with her fingers, replacing the frayed threads with fresh ones spun that morning. The work was dull, but it calmed her, returning her hands to rhythm without tension or pressure, just quiet maintenance. She didn't need to finish everything tonight, but the piece of repair was its own comfort, a ritual she'd long grown to cherish. Outside, thunder growled in the distance, echoing across the moorland, but inside her world was only firelight and the scent of linseed oil. She paused once to sip from a mug of weak ale, more water than brew, but warm enough to smooth her throat. Her cat curled beside her chair, tail twitching in sleep, ears flicking toward the sounds only it could hear. Elsbeth reached into the basket again and pulled out a broken comb. The teeth snapped from forcing knots too quickly. She debated mending it or discarding it, fingers weighing the labor against the usefulness it might regain. Eventually, she laid it aside. Some things were not worth repairing when better could be made from scratch. The comb's wood would become kindling in the morning, feeding the fire that fed her work, a fair exchange. She then began inspecting the loom's beam, running her fingers along the grooves where the threads had once stretched taut. There were chips near the corners, likely from the tension of the merchant's order, but the frame held firm beneath her hands. She wiped it clean with a cloth soaked in vinegar, the scent sharp and cleansing, then oiled the joints to prevent future creak as she worked. Her mind wandered not to markets or silver or orders, but to her mother's hands on this same loom decades before. She remembered learning to weave by firelight, the shadows of the heddles dancing on the walls like ghosts of thread and story. Her mother's voice still echoed in memory. A loom isn't just a frame it's a song you play with your hands. The words had felt poetic, then mysterious and strange, but now they rang as truth etched into callus and skin. Elsbeth finished oiling the beam and stepped back, her muscles stiff but her heart strangely lighter than it had been in days. This moment, this quiet ritual of repair, was as vital as the weaving itself, the care between creation, the breath between songs. She cleaned the floor next, brushing away stray threads and bits of wax, collecting them into a bundle to stuff tomorrow's cushion. The scent of flax lingered in the air, sweet and grassy, a perfume of industry only she could appreciate fully. When the fire finally sank to embers again, she let it die. Trusting that warmth enough would remain until morning, she gathered her mended tools, placing them carefully on the shelf above the hearth, in the order she'd always kept. Then she ran her fingers over the loom's beam once more, a silent good night to the companion that had never failed her as she climbed into bed. Her body groaned with effort, but her mind felt soothed, wrapped in the comfort of quiet maintenance. Outside, the rain fell steadily, washing the village clean, softening the earth that had grown hard beneath too many footsteps. Inside, the cottage breathed in stillness, filled only with the scent of oiled wood, ash, and the peace of things put right again. Elsbeth pulled the blanket up to her chin, closed her eyes, and let sleep carry her not into dreams of work, but into the stillness earned only after long, faithful toil, where nothing stirred but the memory of threads. And in that sleep, the loom stood silent, content, and whole, waiting patiently for morning's light and the next woven song. Chapter 12. Wool for the shepherd's wife. The sky was pale with morning mist as Elsbeth stepped outside, basket in hand, wool cloak draped over her shoulders. The grass glistened with dew, and distant sheep called from the hills, their bleats soft like the yawning of earth itself. She followed the narrow path between hedgerows, stepping carefully over stones slick with moss and the remnants of night's rain. Today she would collect raw fleece from the shepherd's wife, a barter long agreed upon in whispers and handshakes. The wool was not payment in coin, but in promised blankets for warmth, cloaks for winter, cloth strong enough to bind a season. The shepherd's cottage sat on a slope above the village, stone walls sun-warmed, roof thick with thatch browned by years of wind. Smoke coiled from the chimney as Elsbeth approached, the scent of firewood and porridge drifting through the morning air. The door creaked open before she knocked, and Hilda, the shepherd's wife, waved her in with flour-dusted fingers and tired eyes. Inside, the room was warm and cluttered herbs hanging from rafters, loaves rising on the hearth. Dogs curled near the door. Beneath a linen cloth, several bundles of fleece sat waiting, freshly shorn and tied with coarse twine, still smelling of lanolin and pasture. Elsbeth crouched beside them, examining the wool, fingers sinking into the thick locks, checking for knots, dirt, and signs of pests. It was good wool coarse, but clean, a bit yellowed from sun and sweat, but strong enough to spin into something lasting. Hilda poured her a mug of weak cider, and the two women sat by the fire, trading news in murmurs while their hands stayed busy. Elsbeth offered her a scrap of woven cloth in return, tight in pattern, dyed with onion skins and elderberry, warm against the hand. The older woman smiled as she touched it, thumb brushing across the texture, nodding without a word, her thanks written in silence. After a time, Elsbeth packed the fleece into her basket, wrapping it in linen to keep it clean from dust and curious animals. The journey home felt slower, the weight on her back a reminder of labor yet to come, washing, carding, spinning, weaving, shaping. But she welcomed the burden. It meant work. It meant creation. It meant the rhythm of hands pulling rawness into order. Back at her cottage, she filled a basin with rainwater, cool and soft, perfect for drawing dirt from fleece without damaging the fibers. One by one, she submerged each bundle, the water quickly turning cloudy as soil and sweat drifted free like ghosts, leaving cloth. She worked until her arms ached, changing the water again and again, her fingers wrinkled and red by the time the fleece ran clean. Then came the drying. She laid the wool out in the sun, spreading it across the hedge, letting breeze and time finish what soap had begun. The air filled with the scent of lanolin and spring, soft and earthy, like the breath of a sheep exhaled into the wind. By midday, the wool was nearly dry, and she began carding, drawing combs through the locks, smoothing tangles, teasing softness into line. Each pull of the comb was a song in her bones, a memory from girlhood, the sound of bristles dragging through wool like waves against shore. When the fleece fluffed into clouds, she gathered it gently, forming rolags, tight little rolls ready to meet the spinning wheel's hunger. She sat at her spinning stool, one foot on the treadle, hands steady, guiding fiber onto spindle-like feeding thread to a hungry spirit. The wheel turned and sang, a low hum beneath the spinning rhythm, drawing each strand into length, each breath into thread. Hours passed without counting, marked only by shadows on the wall and the weight of finished yarn gathering at her side. The wool spoke as she spun, each twist and pull telling its story. Rain-soaked fields, stone walls, winter berths, summer shearing by sunset. Her lap overflowed with skeins, and her arms trembled with fatigue. But her heart was full with quiet triumph. This thread would become fabric, and that fabric would become warmth, a gift, returned in kind to the shepherd's wife and her kin. Elsbeth hung the yarn in loops across the rafters, letting it rest and breathe, like bread rising, like silence filling a chapel. Then she sat near the window with a cup of broth, watching dusk settle across the village, the rooftops turning silver in the fading light. She thought of Hilda by her own fire now, dogs at her feet, and knew that somewhere in her cottage lay the cloth she'd given, a square of comfort, a whisper of gratitude, stitched into the fabric of lives that often went unnoticed by the world's louder moments. Elsbeth smiled, eyes heavy, hands idle for once, and leaned her head against the wooden frame, the scent of wool clinging to her sleeve. Tomorrow she would prepare the warp and string the loom, and the spinning wheel would rest. But tonight was for stillness, the kind of stillness earned not by the absence of labor, but by the quiet satisfaction of doing what needed to be done. And outside, the sheep moved like shadows in the distant hills, their wool already growing again, ready for the next season's weaving. Chapter 13. The colors of the earth. The sun had not yet cleared the tree line when Elsbeth rose from her cot, breath misting in the chilled morning air. Today she would dye her thread, giving life to the yarn spun from the shepherd's fleece, staining it with the colors of the earth. She moved quietly through her cottage, gathering the skeins now dried and rested, coiled like sleeping serpents across the beam above. Each length of yarn held promise, potential waiting only for color to awaken it, brown for soil, gold for harvest, red for blood and sun. She fetched her old copper pot, blackened with age and memory, and placed it in the hearth, where coals still glowed beneath gray ash. Outside, she gathered firewood stacked beneath the eaves, the pieces brittle and dry, snapping in her hands with satisfying ease. Soon the flames rose, licking the sides of the pot as she poured water into its belly, cold and clear from the well. From a basket on the shelf, she took dried onion skins, marigold petals, walnut husks, and madder root wrapped in linen bundles. Each ingredient was its own chapter in the tale of color, its own kind of magic passed down through hands long buried. She crushed the madder with a stone, the red root flaking like dried blood beneath her fingers, staining her palm like memory. Into the boiling water she dropped the dye madder, and the cottage filled with smells both sweet and bitter, sharp and earthy. She stirred the mixture slowly, watching as the water darkened, its steam curling like spirits rising from the cauldron of morning. Next came the yarn skein by skein. She lowered them in, pressing gently to ensure they drank deeply from the well of pigment. The yarn swirled and sank, twisting in the water like seaweed in a storm, absorbing history with every bubble that rose. Hours passed in silence, but for the crackle of fire and the soft sound of thread soaking in ancient recipes. She lifted each skein from the pot, now transformed, once pale and plain, now deep red like iron, or golden like ripe wheat. She rinsed them in cool water, swirling them through a wooden basin until the dye bled away clean, leaving color behind like truth. Then came the hanging knocross lines strung near the window. She draped each skein, the threads dripping with fire, sun, and soil. The room glowed with warmth, not just from flame, but from hue like autumn leaves, like fruit ripening on the edge of rot. She touched each one with care, as if feeling for a heartbeat beneath the fibers, knowing each would soon be woven into something lasting. The dye pot cooled, but the heat remained in her chest, pride blooming like poppies in her ribs, silent and red as she worked. She remembered the stories her mother told, of women who crushed berries with their feet, who boiled bark in moonlight, of dye secrets whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, stains passed not just onto cloth, but into blood, into tradition. Elsbeth was part of that line now, not by birthright but by labor, by the choice to learn with her hands and remember with her eyes. She stepped outside while the yarn dried, and gathered more lichen and bark from the woods, her fingers brushing moss soft as fleece. There was beauty in what others called waste, the scrap of rust, the skin of an onion, the rot of a log, all carried pigment waiting to bloom. She gathered quietly, not disturbing the birds or the morning's hush, letting the forest know she came not to harm but to borrow. When she returned, the house smelled of dye and firewood, of wet wool and heat, the scent of honest labor and forgotten arts. She took her spindle again and began spinning more, this time mixing undyed wool with colored strands, making thread that whispered both past and present. Outside, children ran past her cottage, their feet thudding softly on the dirt road, their laughter like flutes carried on breeze. They didn't look inside, but she heard them call her name, not with fear or reverence, but with curiosity, as if she were legend and neighbor both. She smiled, hands never still, fingers dancing across the spindle, coaxing yarn from clouded wool and streaks of colored memory. When evening fell, she brought in the dry skeins, now soft and vibrant, smelling faintly of madder and marigold, ready to become cloth. She arranged them by Hewson flower gold beside walnut brown, brick red beside smoke graich, waiting for the warp's invitation. Then she sat near the fire, the empty dye pot beside her, and wrote in the little book her mother once kept. One entry for each color, each formula, each failure and triumph. Her handwriting crooked but steady, her thoughts woven into paper. She was no alchemist, no noble woman, but her work made things live. Her hands told stories in fiber and hue that no ink could hold. Tomorrow she would stretch the warp across her loom and begin the slow, satisfying process of weaving color into shape, motion into memory. But tonight she would rest among the skeins, the hearth warm, the light low, the scent of dye clinging to her hair like smoke. And outside, the earth darkened, but her home glowed lit, not just by fire, but by the colors she had pulled from its skin. Chapter 14. The Loom's Awakening. The loom stood silent against the wall, its frame of dark wood casting tall shadows in the flickering morning light. It had not yet been dressed, not yet called to life. But today would change, that today the threads would find their place. Elsbeth rose early, the floor cool beneath her feet, her breath visible in the morning chill as she moved with quiet purpose. She lit the hearth, not just for warmth, but for presence, for comfort, while her hands tackled the longest task of all. Dressing the loom was a ritual, a test of patience and discipline. One mistake could undo hours of careful work. she laid out the skeins she had dyed, each now wound into balls, the colors chosen for this tapestry full of meaning: earth brown, rust red, golden wheat, and a single thread of sky blue, her quiet homage to the changing seasons. The warp came first, the vertical threads that held the tension, the foundation through which the weft would later pass. She stretched strong threads between the beams, one by one, counting under her breath to keep her spacing exact. Each thread hummed slightly when plucked, like the string of an ancient instrument tuned for silence and labor. She moved with slow grace, hands practiced, fingers nimble from years of spinning and tying and correcting the tiniest mistakes. When the warp was set, tight and parallel, she stepped back and breathed deeply, admiring the bare bones of the future fabric. Then she prepared the heddles, threading each warp strand through the eye of narrow cords that would lift and lower them in patterns. This was the part that demanded silence, attention, a steady heart, and a mind free of distraction, like threading 100 needles blindfolded, each heedle controlled by foot pedals below, each one part of a sequence, a choreography only she knew in full. By midday, the warp was fully dressed, the loom transformed from idle wood to a tensioned skeleton ready to be clothed in motion. She sat and rested, fingers sore, back stiff, yet her spirit calm, for she had passed the hardest test of all preparation. The shuttle waited beside her, a smooth tool carved by her uncle long ago, worn soft where hands had passed over it again and again. She wound the golden yarn onto it, then the red, the brown, preparing each weft like a verse in a poem she had yet to write. With a gentle push of her foot, the first heddles lifted. She threw the shuttle through the gap, pulling the weft tight with the beater, the thunk satisfying, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Then another shed, another pass, another line gold, brown, red each, one locking the past to the present with invisible knots. The fabric began to grow, slowly, row by row, a thing of order and tension, soft yet strong, like skin over bone. As she worked, she began to hum not a tune, but a rhythm, a low song that matched the beat of the shuttle's path. Outside, the village stirred, chickens clucking, carts creaking over stone, but inside her cottage, only thread and thought moved. She paused only for water and bread, eating with one hand while her foot stayed on the pedal, unwilling to stop the flow. By sunset, the cloth stretched a hand's length down the loom, the pattern emerging like a memory recalled slowly, one breath at a time. She ran her palm over it, feeling the weft press against the warp, a sensation like warmth captured in texture and weight. Her mother had taught her that weaving was storytelling without words, that cloth carried meaning far beyond color and shape. It wrapped children at birth, bodies at death, carried grain and tools, and sometimes even dreams sewn into its seams. That night, by firelight, she wove on, not for trade or show, but for the sake of making, of proving something only her hands understood. The loom creaked beneath her, not in protest but in song, its voice growing with each added row, more alive than wood should be. She lost track of time, of the hour, even of hunger. The loom had awakened, and she had answered its call with thread and rhythm. When finally she stood, her legs unsteady, the cloth had grown longer than her forearm, its edges clean, its tension perfect. She smiled, and though no one else would see this piece but her, she knew it mattered, not just as a thing, but as a process. The loom had spoken, and she had listened, and in that unspoken conversation, Something ancient had stirred within her bones. She covered the loom gently with a cloth to protect the work overnight, whispering thanks as if tucking in a child. Then she washed her hands, the scent of wool and dust and oil clinging to her skin, a perfume of honest work in the quiet darkness of her room. She lay thinking not of the finished cloth, but of tomorrow's next row and the ones after that. The loom was not finished, nor was Sheba tonight. The warp held firm, the shuttle rested, and the thread of her purpose remained unbroken. Chapter 15. Patterns from memory. The morning came with a whisper. Sunlight threading through the shutters like stray fibers slipping between boards. Elsbeth sat by the loom before speaking a single word, her breath slow as if afraid to disturb the cloth's silence. She reached for the shuttle, now wound with a new wefta sky-blue thread she had saved, coiled like quiet hope. Today she would begin the pattern, not just color, but structure, a design whispered down from generations before her. Her mother's hands had once followed the same motions, pulling blue thread through brown, red through gold, until meaning emerged. This pattern wasn't written down, it lived in her memory, muscle deep, passed through repetition, not parchment. Each motif told a story, not with letters, but with angles, curves, and crossings, a language of fabric spoken only by those who listened. The first was the river path, diagonal lines weaving left then right, echoing the way water bends through valleys and stone. Next would come the bird's wing, a staggered shape made from short bursts of color, rising like a robin startled from a branch. She pressed her heel to the loom's pedal, raised the heddles, and let the shuttle fly with a practiced flick. Thunk she drew it back, beat the line down, then again, repeating the pattern line by line, breath by breath. Outside, footsteps passed, and dogs barked. But her mind remained inside the thread, counting silently, feeling the tension balance beneath her fingers. She barely blinked as the motifs took shape, the river winding, the wing lifting each one small, precise, but building toward something vast. Her hands moved as though guided by another, her mother's hands, perhaps, or her grandmother's ghost, reminding her not to pull too tight. The cloth grew heavier with memory, row after row, adding weight, not just in wool, but in time itself. At midday, she paused to stretch, her back aching, but her eyes fixed on the growing tapestry, the shapes rising like spoken names. She remembered sitting beside her mother's loom as a girl, legs tucked beneath her, watching the same pattern unfold row by row. Too young to understand, she'd once thought the cloth wove itself, that the loom was magic, not the weaver. Now she knew better, and that made it no less magical, only that the spell required effort, silence, and the sacrifice of time. She sipped warm broth from a wooden bowl, then resumed, pressing onward, the pattern now shifting toward the tree root. This one was hardesta, tangle of dark and light, shaped like fingers grasping into earth, a symbol of endurance and legacy. She hesitated for a moment, checking the count in her mind, recalling the angle, the thread jumps, the crossings. Then she began again, slow, careful, like walking across ice, knowing one misstep could fracture the whole design, each line built upon the last, each crossing reliant on precision, patience, and memory more than vision or reference. The root motif always reminded her of her father. Though he never wove, he worked the land, digging deep and planting slow. He had called weaving soil for the hands, and she never forgot it. Not once in all her years at the loom. By late afternoon, the entire base of the tapestry showed a full cycle river, wing, root. Then it began again. Repetition gave the pattern rhythm, like heartbeat or breath, something ancient and biological woven into both cloth and the one who wove it. The blue thread danced across the browns and reds like veins through stone, subtle but insistent, not for beauty, but for meaning. She stepped away and studied it from a distance, pleased with its balance, its truth not perfect, but true, and that was enough. That night, she lit a second candle, refusing to leave the pattern unfinished, her mind too deep in the story to pause. Each new row was a continuation, not just of design, but of memory, hers, her mother's, and all those before. She imagined their voices in the hush of the loom's creak. Not ghosts, but echoes made tangible in fiber and motion. When her hands finally stilled, the candle burned low, and the cloth was nearly as long as her arm. She touched it gently, as if afraid it would disappear, then ran her fingers along each motif in order, remembering what they meant: river for change, wing for hope, root for strength, 3 symbols, 3 truths, spoken in wool and rhythm. She wrapped the unfinished cloth in linen, tied it carefully, and placed it beside her bed like a secret worth guarding. In the dark, she lay still, her mind still weaving, eyes closed, seeing not dreams but patterns continuing across the thread of her memory. Chapter 16. Fingers of the wind. The morning wind stirred before the sun appeared, soft and cold, carrying the scent of wet grass and spinning ash. Elsbeth pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped into the loom room, the air inside sharp with the chill of the stones. The cloth waited where she had left it, rolled and protected, the patterns hidden inside like secrets folded between pages. She placed her hand on it, palm flat, feeling the texture rough yet smooth, tightly bound threads breathing warmth into her skin. Today would be a different task, not just the continuation of patterns, but the beginning of a new challenge. Fringe was not merely a decoration, it was the wind's touch, the cloth's soft ending, its release from the precision of weaving. The threads would no longer be trapped between heddles and beater bars, but free, dancing in the air like hair loosened from braids. She unraveled the final section gently, leaving long ends untouched, knowing the transition from pattern to fringe must be graceful. Each length had to be tied off by hand, knotted in pairs, twisted and held together like fingers closing against a breeze. She began with the right edge, bending low, eyes squinting at the first threads as she smoothed and counted them 2 by 2. The process was slow, repetitive, almost meditative: tie, twist, tighten, and then move to the next set with steady breath. In the stillness of the room, she heard only the soft brushing of thread and her own heartbeat echoing off the wood. Knot after knot, she worked across the edge, giving form to the fringe, neither part of the pattern nor separate from it. It reminded her of walking a forest path, where order ends and wild begins. Where branches reach without rules, the fringe would hang when the cloth did, rippling with every breeze, catching candlelight, swaying with movement, a whisper of freedom. As she nodded, she thought of the wind itself, how it moved without being seen, only known through touch and sound, the way it curled through the village, flipped pages, pulled cloaks, and stole breath from lips during frost-snap mornings. The fringe was a tribute to that woven air, controlled chaos, each strand both tethered and alive. She reached the halfway point and paused, sitting back to stretch her hands, the knuckles aching from the repeated pull of the cord. She flexed her fingers and looked at her work rows of tiny knots, each holding a story, a thread, a beginning. The cloth itself no longer looked like mere material. It was taking on a soul, a presence that watched her from its folded surface. She could imagine it already on the wall of the weaving hall, or in a cottage, or draped over shoulders on cold market mornings. The fringe would move when someone walked, a silent gesture of history carried without notice or explanation. Her thoughts returned to the first cloth she'd ever finished. It had no fringe, only a jagged, uneven edge left bare and rushed. She remembered how it unraveled days later, the threads pulling loose, the work unspooling slowly like a dream, dissolving after waking. Back then, she didn't understand the importance of endings. The way a cloth finished said as much as how it began. Now she knew the end needed care, the same patience as the first row, the same hands, the same heart. She resumed tying, her breath matching the rhythm. Inhale, loop, twist, exhale, tighten, then shift to the next. Outside, the wind picked up, knocking softly on the shutters, almost like it wanted in, eager to touch the fringe. She smiled at the thought, and imagined the wind as a friend, watching her, waiting to greet the finished edge with open arms. The second half of the fringe moved faster, her hands trained by repetition, her mind floating freely between movement and memory. She thought of her sister, who used to braid her hair in much the same way, gentle pulls, a slow rhythm, fingers finding order. Her sister had long since married and moved away, but Elsbeth still carried her voice, laughing as they worked under summer trees. Each twist of thread felt like a braid, a thread woven into family, into connection, into the strands of people no longer nearby. As the final knot tightened, she sat back once more and looked at the finished edge, soft and orderly, yet wild at the tips. The cloth was no longer just an object. It was complete, whole, with breath and grace, ready to move and to be moved. She rose slowly, stretching her arms toward the ceiling beams, her back stiff but her spirit light, satisfied in quiet triumph. The last step was to lift the cloth from the loom, which she did with careful reverence, like cradling something living. It hung limp at first, then shifted and rolled in her arms, its weight distributing evenly, its patterns catching light. She laid it across the table and ran her fingers along its surface, river, wing, root, and now, the fingers of wind at its edge. The cloth was ready to leave her hands, but a part of her would remain within it, woven between colors, patterns, and knots. She folded it slowly, wrapping it in soft linen, and placed it inside the woven basket lined with dried lavender for scent. Tomorrow she would carry it to the village square for trade or offering, but tonight it belonged to her alone. And when she slept, she dreamed not of looms or knots, but of wind passing through threads, lifting the edges into dance. Chapter 17 dies from the earth. Before the cloth came color, before beauty came blood, before weaving came the dye pot steaming in the yard. Elsbeth rose before the sun again, but this time not to thread or tighten looms, but to harvest pigment from the earth itself. She wore her older dress, the one stained at the sleeves and knees, fabric marked by years of kneeling in muddy beds and boiling pots. The garden where the dye plants grew was tucked beyond the henhouse, an area dense with greens, purples, and strange bitter reds. Madder root grew low, tangled and hidden beneath chalky soil, its pigment strong enough to stain fingers for days. Woad reached higher, tall and soft-leafed, with the power to yield deep blues if coaxed properly from its tender veins. She crouched and dug carefully, pulling at the roots with her knife. shaking loose the dirt, placing each plant gently into her basket. Each one had a voice, not audible but sense-muttering, secrets of the ground, of age, of color buried and waiting to be revealed. She worked slowly, her back aching early, but she did not rush, for rushing led to spoiled color and wasted time. As she gathered onion skins from the kitchen, she thought of yellow, the bright, golden hue it would produce when boiled with iron salts. She ground walnut husks into powder later, a bitter, dark shade that would coat cloth in hues like tree bark after rain. Dyeing cloth was not as simple as dipping and drying. It was a dance of temperature, acidity, salts, and time. Each fiber accepted dye differently. Wool drank it in greedily, while linen resisted, needing more coaxing and time in the pot. She filled a large iron cauldron with rainwater, setting it above a fire made from dry wood and bark, letting it come to a gentle boil. The smell was pungent, already earth, bitterness, ash, and copper, the scent of a transformation too ancient to name. She began with madder, placing the roots into a linen bag and soaking them in warm water, watching it bleed slowly, like a wound. The red emerged gradually, not bright but deep and powerful, the color of clay and life and rusted tools long buried. She stirred with a long stick, ensuring the heat never reached a boiling, ruined the depth, flattened the richness. The cloth had been pre-soaked in a mordant solution the day before, alum and vinegar. To open the fibers and ready them for binding, she dipped it slowly into the red bath, inch by inch, ensuring even exposure. Watching the fibers absorb and darken in the heat, she held her breath as the color shifted, deepening, saturating. Removing it was delicate too fast, and it would streak, too slow, and it would fade before setting. So she moved with perfect patience. She hung it in the shade, out of sunlight, letting the wind kiss it gently, while it cooled and the dye locked into its new home. Next came woad, a far trickier substance, requiring fermentation and magic far beyond the simplicity of boiling and dipping. She crushed the woad leaves into a blue paste, fermented with stale urine and covered with linen, left near the fire to coax life. The smell was unbearable, but the result, a true and rare blue, was worth the sacrifice of breath and taste for an entire afternoon. Blue took time dipping, airing, dipping again each layer, deepening, each breath of oxygen turning green to blue in a slow alchemy. She watched the cloth transform in front of her eyes, as if kissed by sky and cold wind, a tone that felt both rich and distant. Last was yellow from onion skins and iron salt, a color sharp like sun on brass, less common, but perfect for borders and trim. The cloth soaked quickly in this brew, eager for brightness after red and blue, lifting the fabric to a new level of contrast. Once all the cloth was dyed, she laid them flat on the clean grass, weighted at the edges by stones, watching them dry like flags of her craft. The garden hummed around herbies, circling, chickens pecking, wind turning pages of her notebook, filled with old recipes and symbols. She took notes, always, because dyeing was unpredictably a pinch too much salt, too little acid, too much sun, and the color vanished forever. She felt as though she were speaking to the plants, bartering with them, begging them to give up their souls and stain her work with memory. When the cloths had dried fully, she folded them into soft piles, hands red-stained and blue-smudged, arms aching but heart full. They were no longer blank, no longer just protection against cold. They were story and soil and light bound into something wearable. She touched the madder red and saw firelight, ceremony, deep wine, and wounds stitched with care and time. She touched the woad blue and saw night, sorrow, sea, and silence. The sound of footsteps on wet stone. She touched the yellow and saw sun, laughter, coin, and straw scattered across wooden floors during harvest celebrations. Color had returned to her world through these hands, and as she carried the cloths inside, she imagined how they'd shine by firelight. She thought of the women who would wear them, the children who would wrap themselves in them, the traders who would barter for them, and she realized she wasn't merely weaving thread anymore. She was weaving emotion, memory, seasons, even the voice of the land itself. Dye was more than color, it was transformation, devotion, a bond between earth and cloth, sealed by steam and silence. That night, her fingers burned slightly from the mordants. Her palms tingled with the memory of heat, but she did not mind. She dreamed of rivers that flowed red, hills of blue mist, fields of golden wheat, all cloth, all story, all waiting to be woven. Chapter 18. The Weaver's Table. By the time the dyed cloths were folded and cooled, the hearth was glowing low and warm. Elsbeth returned to her corner of the cottage, where the loom stood like a silent beast waiting to be fed. The weaver's table beside it was cluttered with old bobbins, wool scraps, a bone needle, and jars of oil for greasing the threads. Each item had been placed deliberately, even if it looked chaotic to anyone else. A weaver's order was her own kind of architecture. The table wasn't wide, but it held everything: essential tools of rhythm, patience, and detail, worn from years of touch. She sat with her back straight, lowering the lamp until the shadows fell behind the loom and not across her threads. In her lap, she held the red cloth first, running her fingers over it, as if memorizing every inch before the next steps began. Before weaving, she had to plan the pattern. This wasn't guesswork. It was logic, tradition, and rhythm stitched into the bone. She used a piece of chalk to mark her measurements, mapping each inch with precision that felt more sacred than mathematical. The warp threads had already been strung earlier, that weak vertical threads stretched tight like harp strings, singing silently. These threads were pale, nearly white, and strong enough to carry whatever color and tension the weft would soon press into them. She selected a shuttle from the box beneath the table, a narrow wooden tool carved by her grandfather years ago, still smooth with use. Onto it she wound the madder-red yarn, carefully feeding the tail through the notch. Testing the glide between her fingers, she lifted the heddle, separating half the warp threads upward, forming a tunnel for the shuttle to pass through with a satisfying slide. Weaving wasn't just about cloth, it was about momentum, keeping your breath steady, your tension even, your arms loose but focused. She passed the shuttle through, pulled it back across, changed the shed, beat the line tight with the comb-like reed hanging from the loom. Each motion had been done 10,000 times before, and still she counted every beat, every pick, every pass. The rhythm was slow at first, her mind measuring out each line of the pattern she'd designed at dawn. A red section came first, pure and wide, meant to be the heart of the blanket's body, warm like wine and earth. She followed it with a border of pale yellow thread, forming geometric shapes like teeth or fields viewed from above. Blue came nextward, dyed and whispering like dusk, a band that reminded her of night skies and distant mountains she'd never seen. The table to her left rattled as she shifted her weight, tools tumbling slightly as the loom absorbed the push and pull of the tension. She paused only to sip broth from a wooden cup or to adjust the lantern when the wick burned too low. The firelight cast long shadows from the threads, making them appear like tangled dancers across the floorboards. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the shutters, but inside, the only sound was the soft thunk of the heddle dropping into place. Every few rows, she inspected her work, not just for mistakes, but to make sure the soul of it still felt whole. A weave without spirit was just cloth. A good weaver knew how to bind breath and meaning into every crossing thread. When her fingers grew sore, she dipped them in the oil jar, rubbing them gently to keep the joints from stiffening. The oil smelled of rosemary and beeswax, soothing her skin and helping the thread slip smoother through her grasp. The red cloth was taking shape, line by line, row by row, transforming from raw material into something weighted with purpose. She envisioned it wrapping a child in winter, or covering a bride's shoulders on her wedding day, or even lining a coffin. Each possible fate made her more careful, more devoted. The cloth might outlive her, might become a family's oldest story. The table creaked again as she shifted to take a new shuttle, this one wound with dark walnut brown to add weight to the borders. No thread was chosen without intention. Every color had meaning. Every line had balance, like poetry spun from fibers and breaths. She thought about her mother's old cloths, still used, still loved, the ones that survived 40 winters and countless washings. Would this one last as long? Would it be passed down or burned in some storm-struck night when homes turned to ash? It didn't matter. What mattered was the hands, the table, the thread moving under and over with her heartbeat. Hours passed, unnoticed, except by the steady growth of fabric and the cooling broth by her elbow. Untouched for hours, she did not leave the weaver's table until the first border section was complete. A full square foot of dense, glowing pattern. She tied off the threads for the night, covering the cloth gently with linen to protect it from dust and moths. The tools on her table were rearranged quietly, set into place like ritual objects, each ready for tomorrow's labor. She washed her hands with rosewater, the scent rising in steam as she whispered a short prayer for steady fingers. By the time she stood up, her back cracked, her knees ached, and the night had deepened to a silence that felt like velvet. The weaver's table was empty again, the loom resting, its threads humming softly like a dream waiting to be woven once more. Elsbeth smiled, tired but calm, and turned toward her bed, the scent of wool and madder lingering on her fingers like a vow. She slept that night with dreams of flying cloth, shifting colors, and the warm hum of thread dancing between her palms. Chapter 19. The Merchant's Eye by Morning. The loom still carried the weight of the pattern she had woven the night before. Elsbeth rose before the first rooster's call, eyes heavy but heart filled with purpose and quiet resolve. The cottage was cold. Her breath puffed faint clouds in the air as she moved toward the fire. She stoked the embers with practiced care, placing dry splinters and straw until flame caught and spread with a low roar. The cloth she'd protected beneath linen was untouched, its red threads vibrant and borders tight with careful rhythm. Today was not for weaving, it was for proving, showing, and convincing someone that her work was worth silver and salt. The merchant came twice a season, often with his cart half full and eyes scanning every detail like a bird of prey. He was known for quick judgment. Elsbeth knew she had only moments to impress him, and she'd spent the entire month preparing for that very breath of time. She selected the best pieces to new shawls, the red cloth still unfinished, and an older blue tunic she'd kept back for emergencies. She laid them on the table in the morning sun, smoothing every crease, brushing off lint with a feather from the hearth broom. Each cloth had to tell a story, not just of color and warmth, but of time, patience, and craftsmanship no machine could mimic. Outside, wheels crunched gravel, and chickens scattered as the merchant escort rattled to a stop at the edge of the lane. He stepped down, dressed in wool finer than most villagers had seen in years, trimmed in fur and smelling faintly of lavender. Elsbeth wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward, greeting him not with a smile, but with calm, unwavering eyes. "Show me," he said plainly, not wasting time with pleasantries, his gaze already fixed on the red cloth beneath the linen. She didn't rush, letting him take it in slowly. The merchant ran his fingers over the weave, pressing gently to test the tightness, the durability, the fineness of the yarn. He nodded once, silent, moving on to the shawl, then the tunic, asking short, specific questions about dye source and warp tension. Elsbeth answered, with precision mater from the southern banks, warp at 8 threads per inch, beaten firm after each pick. He appreciated clarity. She knew that merchants dealt in facts, not feelings, and her answers gave him exactly what he needed. "What's the price?" he asked, eyeing the red cloth again, fingers lingering near the corner stitched with blue and yellow teeth. She didn't blink. "For silver, for the shawl, 10 for the tunic. The red cloth is not for sale," she said evenly. He raised an eyebrow. "Then why show it?" "To set the standard," she replied, "and to remind you what my hands are capable of when paid fairly." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first sign of amusement or respect she'd seen in seasons past, expecting her to fold out of necessity. But Elsbeth shook her head. "You've seen my seams. You've seen my pattern holds. These are not rush jobs or filler wares." They haggled back and forth, the sun rising higher behind them as the crows circled and called from the hedges. Their weight both relief and proof. He took the shawl and the tunic, folding them into his cart, laying them atop bundles from other villages. Then he paused. "The red one when it's finished, I want first offer," he said, voice lower, almost respectful. She nodded, not committing, but acknowledging the offer like a sealed promise kept for another day. When he left, she watched the dust rise from the wheels, listened to the fading jingle of his tack, and felt the weight in her hand. Silver, real and solid, cold from his pouch but warming quickly in her skin-worn palm. It wouldn't last forever, but it meant food, oil, salt, maybe even thread for new dye experiments next month. She returned to the loom with a strange calm, her steps unhurried, her breath easier than it had been in weeks. The unfinished red cloth seemed to glow now, as if knowing it had impressed even a hard bargaining eye. She touched the warp threads gently, her fingers moving with renewed tenderness, not for sale, but for legacy now. Sometimes the merchant's eye brought nothing but judgment, but today it brought validation and the chance to keep weaving. She tied her apron tighter, turned the lantern wick up, even though it was still bright, and resumed her rhythm. Thread passed through warp, the beat fell in place, and the world narrowed again into movement, texture, and pattern. For a few quiet hours, Elsbeth forgot the coin and the merchant, letting her loom sing its quiet, constant song. It was not about profit, not always sometimes. It was just the joy of creating something with hands and heart. But she'd remember his face, his interest, his smirk hand. she'd be ready when he returned in spring. She would have better cloth, bolder dyes, tighter seams, and more questions for him to answer next time. Because now he knew she was not a girl spinning thread in shadow, but a weaver worth silver, time, and reputation. The loom creaked, the shuttle hummed, and the red cloth lengthened row by row under her steady gaze. Chapter 20. The last stitch dawn arrived with a quiet grace, casting pale light through the cottage window where Elsbeth's loom stood waiting. The red cloth was nearly complete now, its threads tightly locked in place, shimmering slightly in the dim morning. A hush filled the room as she approached it, as if even the floorboards held their breath. This was the last day she would sit at this loom for the season, and she knew it. Not because the work was done, work was never done, but because this cloth marked an end and a beginning. Every thread she'd spun held memories of stormy nights, of broken needles, of hunger and triumph. She traced the woven pattern with her fingertips, eyes studying the symmetry, searching for imperfections. There were a few, of course. No cloth was perfect, but they told the story of hands, of life, not of machines. She tied her apron around her waist and seated herself gently, the bench creaking under the familiar weight of purpose. The shuttle was already threaded, waiting like a loyal companion ready to finish the journey with her. Outside, frost coated the grass in silver lace, but inside the warmth of memory filled the tiny house. She dipped her head, breathed deeply, and began weaving, the soft beat of the loom echoing like a heartbeat. Each pass of the shuttle brought her closer to the end, but also deeper into the fabric of herself. She remembered her mother's hands, strong and brown, teaching her the rhythm and patience the loom demanded. Her mother had woven until her hands gave out, until her sight dimmed and the cloth went unfinished. Elsbeth had finished that cloth years ago, weeping into the wool as she tied the final knots. Now this cloth would not be left unfinished. She would complete it, not just for trade, but for legacy. She paused to rest her wrists, watching dust swirl in the light beams like silk threads floating on air. The red in the fabric was rich and bold, a color earned through boiling matter and hours of careful attention. The border glowed with gold and blue lines, small symbols repeating like echoes of a hidden song. Every row was a sentence, every beat a breath together. The cloth read like a secret only she understood. Her fingers moved on instinct now, no longer thinking of warp or weft, only of completion. By midday, the final edge neared. The final inch narrowed her focus until nothing else remained. Outside, children's voices carried in the cold wind. A dog barked. A kettle boiled in someone else's home. But Elsbeth sat still, eyes fixed, breath slow, until the last shuttle passed and she tightened the final thread. She tied it off with care, a double knot as her mother had taught, a sign of honor and strength. Then she sat back, hands in her lap, the cloth resting fully formed in front of her like a newborn child. For a moment she didn't move, didn't breathe, simply stared and let the enormity of it settle in her chest. It was not the most cloth she'd ever made, nor the most intricate, but it was the most hers. Every hour, every blister, every choice of color and pattern had been entirely hers to command. She stood slowly and stretched her back, stiff from days hunched over her craft, joints popping like floorboards. With both hands she lifted the cloth, heavy and warm, folded it once, then again, then laid it on the clean table. The loom looked empty now, like a tool without purpose, its threads cut, its shuttle at rest. She cleaned her tools methodically, wiping the wood with oil, sweeping stray threads into the fire. Then she swept the floor, not for dirt, but for closure, watching the broom's bristles catch the smallest remnants of labor. She lit a candle, even though the light was still good, felt like a ritual, a small flame of thanks. Then she sat beside the folded cloth, her hands resting on top of it, eyes closed in soft meditation. Soon, another season would begin. New cloth would be needed. Repairs would pile up. Patterns would change. But today was an ending, a sacred one, and she honored it with silence and stillness. There would be no celebration, no feast, no one knocking on the door to offer praise. But the satisfaction was deep, the kind that made the stomach still and the chest warm. She'd made something from nothing, turned fluff into strength, chaos into design. She looked out the window, past the trees, to where the village smoke rose in thin gray lines. Someone would wear this cloth someday, not knowing her name, not knowing her calluses or her long hours. But they would feel the warmth, the strength, the subtle joy stitched into every row. That was enough. That was what it meant to be a weaver, not just of thread, but of time and meaning. She stood one final time, kissed her fingertips, and touched the cloth's edge, whispering a quiet thank you. Then she stepped away, leaving the loom behind, not empty, but waiting, always waiting for her return. Because when winter passed and days grew longer, the shuttle would call again, and Elsbeth would answer not for silver, not for fame, but because weaving was how she remembered to breathe, and in every breath she stitched herself back together, one thread at a time. The end.